Writing is one of those tasks that everybody thinks is super easy with generative AI. They say, you just go and ask ChatGPT to write it for you until you actually try to do that. And you realize the difficulty of getting generative AI or getting ChatGPT to write something in the voice that you want, that has all the right information, the right style. Actually controlling the writing that generative AI produces is an incredibly difficult task, and it requires a lot of prompt engineering. And we're going to use writing as something to help us explore all the different components of a prompt and why they exist and why we might manipulate them. Because in order to manipulate writing and try to get a voice that we own and that we craft that generative AI is producing, not just a bunch of emojis, a bunch of social media sounding writing, if we really want to craft something that has a particular voice, a particular style, something that somebody's going to pay attention to, they're going to associate with us, just like if we were a writer and we want to have our own voice, we want to have our own style, our own way of doing things. Well, we want to build that type of prompt. We want to have a way of creating a prompt that when we go and we want to write something, it has a unique style that follows something that is our aesthetic, that's our way of analyzing and looking at the world, and isn't just generative AI dumping out an answer for us. Now, this is something that I want you to think about throughout this course, is we want to use generative AI in a way that enhances what we do and how we think and how creative we are. We want to augment our intelligence. We want to think more about the problems we're solving, not less. And when it comes to writing, it turns out we want to do the same thing with generative AI. We don't want it to become our voice. We don't all want to adopt this social media sounding voice or whatever the voice is of the topic area that you're writing on. We don't want it to choose for us. I don't want to give up my voice in writing to generative AI. I want to take control of that voice. And I want to use generative AI to help me write in the voice that captures my ideas and my thoughts in my style. But my style in generative AI is really, really hard. So we're going to explore why this is difficult. We're going to then look at all the components of a prompt that can help us take control of the voice of writing, and then think about how we can build patterns to capture our own writing in different contexts that we can use if we want to draft an email, or we can use if we want to draft a section of a white paper, or we can use if we want to write a blog post that will be who we are, not who generative AI is, and will capture our thoughts. Now, let's just start off with a bad example, and this is where most people go when they start with prompting, is they just give it a bunch of instructions and they say, hey, write something for me. So right here I say, I need to write an email to my colleagues at Vanderbilt explaining that we are launching a new prompt engineering class on Coursera that our graduate students might take. Now, this is not a very good prompt, and we'll explore why as we go, but let's take a look at what it does. It says, sure, here's a draft for an email for you. Subject, new prompt engineering class on Coursera, exciting opportunity for graduate students. Let's just go ahead and start critiquing this email. Never am I going to send an email to my colleagues that says exciting opportunity for graduate students about my course. That is just not something I'm going to do. Then it goes on and it says, I'm thrilled to announce the launch of our new prompt engineering class on Coursera. I'm never going to probably write I'm thrilled to announce unless maybe it's on a social media post, in which case I might do it because that's kind of the style of social media. But if I'm writing an email to my colleagues at Vanderbilt, I am not going to start that email with I'm thrilled to announce, which sounds like I'm writing a social media post. So there's a fundamental problem with the voice, the tone. This is not me. Now, if we go on and we look at it, it goes then and says, key features of the course. Comprehensive curriculum, expert instructors, flexible learning. Well, it's kind of funny because if you go back and look at my initial prompt, there's nothing about the course in there. And this is hallucination at work. It's what people go nuts about. And they say, oh my gosh, it hallucinates. How are you ever going to use it? And most people that I see saying this are using it like this. There's just a fundamental lack of prompt engineering. And they assume because it's written a lot of stuff that they've done a good job with their prompt. And this prompt is lacking in so many ways that we're going to dissect. And then what we get because of that is we get hallucination. It's hallucinating the content of my course, what's in it, comprehensive curriculum? We don't know if it's comprehensive or not, because in fact, I'm filming the course right now, so it doesn't even exist. So I can say definitively there is not a comprehensive curriculum. Now, that's what we see when we see people sort of saying it writes well, is they say that sort of naively without really, fully understanding the difficulty of this task and how much has to go into it. Let's think about what we would do. Now, imagine that I told you, I want you to go and write like William Faulkner. He has a very particular style. If I told you to go and write like William Faulkner, what are you going to do? You're not going to immediately begin writing. You're probably going to go and you're going to read a lot of William Faulkner's work and try to learn and understand how William Faulkner writes. And then what you're going to do is you're going to then probably go and write some, and then you're going to look and you're going to compare your writing to William Faulkner's writing. You're going to see where your style matches, where it doesn't. You're probably going to get outside perspectives. It's going to be an incredibly difficult task. And that's what people don't understand, is that going and actually writing something requires enormous time and energy and complexity to match a style, to match a voice, to match our ideas. And we're going to explore, how do we do that with prompt engineering? How do we take a prompt and begin capturing our voice in that prompt, our ideas in that prompt? And what do we have to use from a prompt engineering perspective to do that effectively? So what do I do when my prompt doesn't really capture my voice? When it's not really saying things in my style, it's got the wrong content, it doesn't have my ideas, it just got the wrong tone. Well, what do I do? Well, I start going and modifying one of the most fundamental components of a prompt, which is the instructions. So typically we write prompts that are full of instructions of what we want the large language model to do, what we don't want it to do. And if you think about the way that many people use it, they use it to ask questions. And questions are essentially an instruction, which are, tell me this, tell me the answer to this. Now, how do we go in or use instructions to start manipulating the language that's coming out of it and improve what we're doing? Well, we could go and we could do something like this. We could say, okay, I didn't like that. I'm thrilled to announce, social media sounding email that it generated for me. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to go in and I'm going to tell it, don't use any hyperbolic language like I'm thrilled to announce. And don't talk about anything you don't know about, because if you remember the original email, it hallucinated the content of my course. I hadn't told it what the content of my course was. It didn't have access to that information, so it hallucinated it. So I'm adding some instructions to the prompt to try to tell it and craft what it does a little bit more specifically. So I'm going to go and say, don't be hyperbolic. Don't talk about things you don't know. And now let's see what happens. So now we get a new email. And it says, I hope this message finds you well. It's still not really my voice, but it's not, I'm thrilled to announce anymore. It's not hyperbolic. It's not this big, exciting language anymore. And what we also see is happening is we don't have a big outline that's hallucinated of the course anymore, because we've started to refine the instructions of what it is supposed to do. And that's helping us to get rid of that hallucination. But something interesting has happened. And can you notice and can you spot what it's done that's kind of fascinating? It's left out my name. Now, originally it knew my name, and this was because of the GPT, the new ChatGPT memory capabilities. It knows my name, and it can also introduce that in the conversation because it knows who I am, and that's being introduced to the prompt behind the scenes. But in my instructions, I said specifically, do not talk about anything you don't know about. And I think one of the side effects of that instruction is it's like, I don't really know about Jules White, and so I'm now refusing to talk about Jules White. Now, I was on a fascinating panel discussion where they were discussing how they go and try to put the guardrails and refine the models to, produce output that we want. And the story was that early on at OpenAI, when they were trying to refine the content that it was producing, they were saying, don't have it go and produce content that's really gory and graphic in detail. So like if you're going for a medical description, you want something that's more high level. You don't need like graphic, gory details of something related to a disease. We want something that's more like what we see when we go on a website. And the result of that was that the model stopped talking about sharks. It just refused to talk about sharks because it had this connection between sharks and graphic, gory details. Now, I think what we're seeing here is probably something a little bit like that. Now, I don't have any scientific proof that that's the case, but I think when I say don't talk about something you don't know about, then what we see is it takes my name off of that because it's like, I don't know about Jules White. And I'm not positive that Jules White is the one that's telling me to do this and then the letter is supposed to be from. It also takes away that hallucinated course content. But it shows you something important, which is that instructions in language, when we start creating instructions, they're inherently imprecise. Our language is not perfect, and there can be multiple ways of interpreting the language in our instructions that we may not be aware of. We may not capture and understand that there's a side effect to our language based on some interpretation. And each time we submit the prompt, we may get a variation in interpretation on those instructions. So we have to be aware of that. Instructions are great, but they're imprecise often. And often they require additional context to know the true meaning of the instruction. So I'm going to go and I'm going to modify my prompt again. And I'm going to try to fix this. And I'm going to say, please use my email, or please use my name at the end of the email. So like, I know you don't know about me, but it's okay to add my name to the end of the email. That's okay to talk about. And then the other thing I didn't really like about the email is there's no why. Why should anybody care about this? You know, why should we have our graduate students do this? And so I go and I added yet another instruction. Explain why learning about prompt engineering is good for graduate students. And so I'm taking my original prompt, I'm going and I'm refining it by introducing new instructions. And the more instructions that I'm giving it, the more rules it's having to follow, the more constraints on the output that's going to help guide it to the end result that I want. And now I get a much better email. Is this still good enough? Is this me? The answer is no, but it's much better. For example, now it says, understanding how to create and refine prompts is crucial for anyone working with generative AI technologies. This course will provide graduate students with practical knowledge and techniques that enhance their research capabilities, and it includes my name at the end of the email. Now, this is much better, and we've taken the first step in harnessing generative AI in a way that can communicate in the way that we want to communicate, that can write in the style that we want it to write in. We're not just letting it write however it wants. We're going and we're starting that journey of taking control of generative AI through prompt engineering. But we're still not there yet. This is a very difficult task that requires a lot of different techniques to take advantage of. Now, most people stop with instructions. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to start going beyond instructions. Because really to build powerful prompts, we have to go beyond just looking at how do we modify the instructions. Now, we talked about instructions and how we can modify the instructions in a prompt to try to produce a better output. Now let's start going beyond just modifying the instructions in a prompt and looking at other things that we can do. Now, one of the most basic things that I always emphasize and tell people about, and if you've taken my other courses, is this idea of iterative refinement through a conversation. That we're not going to go and look at one prompt anymore, but we're going to actually start looking at how we refine content over a series of prompts, where we have a conversation with generative AI in order to achieve some goal. And we're going to start looking at how we can use this to begin shaping language. But what we're going to do different than what was in my course before is we're going to look at why this is working. And we're going to start to get some intuition about what's special when we do this. So let's go back to the example that we did before of writing this email for my colleagues. So I had this prompt that I had gone and I'd iteratively added instructions to the prompt. So basically what I did is I took the prompt, I ran it, I got some output. I went and started a new conversation, but in the new conversation, I took the original prompt and I added more instructions to it. And now this is a really important distinction. I was not in the same conversation going and submitting the new prompt with additional instructions. I was taking one prompt, getting an output, starting a new conversation, adding instructions to it, getting output. I was not continuing the conversation. So this time what we're going to do is we're going to, instead of going and starting a new conversation, we're going to begin adding instructions, but we're going to do it by follow-up prompts in the conversation. So this was my original prompt, and this was the output email that I got. Now I like this email. It's better than where I started, but it's still not me. It's not good enough, and it's missing some of the things. Like if I was writing this email, I'm not going to say understanding how to create and refine prompts is crucial for anyone working with generative AI, because I think we need to motivate why we should care about generative AI in the first place. And in fact, I spent so much time just doing this, trying to tell people we really need to care about generative AI, and here's why. So that is a missing component to this email. Now, I could modify the prompt, start a new conversation, start over and do that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to follow up in the next message in the conversation is I'm going to say, explain why this is important for graduate students in the context of the rapid rise of generative AI in industry. Because one thing that everybody usually relates to in academia is I can tell them the subject is important and they can argue with me. They can tell me all kinds of reasons why they think it is or is not. But if I say our students won't get jobs if they don't know this, people pay attention. Because that we all have to agree at some point is one of our goals is we want to educate our students and we want them to get jobs. So if we say they need to know this for industry, people tend to care. So when I follow up with this prompt, I am essentially adding instructions to the original prompt, and we'll see why in a second. And then it comes back, and now it says, I hope this message finds you well. I'm writing to inform you. And then I have, with the rapid rise of generative AI in industry, understanding how to create and refine prompts is crucial for anyone working with these technologies. Generative AI models are being integrated into a wide range of applications from natural language processing to image generation, blah, blah, blah. So now it's motivating this from the perspective of industry. It's followed my instructions. It's now gone and it's refined the content. It's adding in a key idea that I want to convey in my writing. Now, it's still not quite there. And, you know, the one thing that I don't like about this, and a lot of times when it writes, is it kind of sounds like marketing copy. And this is probably because generative AI was trained on a ton of marketing copy that was out on the web. You know, web pages typically aren't how I, communicate. Like, that's not my style of communication. And, brochures, other things like that. So I need to start, honing that in and sort of capturing that idea and saying, let's throw that out. And we need to kind of constrain our language to look more like this. So I go back and I say, write this so that it sounds less like marketing copy and more like a faculty member trying to convey the importance of a curriculum addition. And now it goes back and it says, dear colleagues, I hope this message finds you well. I don't know why it says that. It loves to say that. I've heard that in a lot of writing. I would probably add that as one of my instructions. Don't say, I hope this message finds you well, because I've never written that in a single email, I think, in my life. And now it says, I wanted to let you know about a new course. Given the rapid rise of generative AI, understanding prompt engineering is critical. And it goes on and, it does a better job. It sounds a little more like what I want. It's still not there yet. Now, at the beginning, I said something important. I said there's a difference between modifying the prompt to include new instructions and having a conversation where we're iteratively refining the content in our conversation. And I want you to think for a minute, what is the big difference that we get when we start having a conversation versus just taking our prompt and adding additional instructions in? The big difference is that the conversation is one prompt. Yeah, and that is a crazy concept. But although it looks like, as we're going in and submitting messages, that it's just seeing each individual message, we know that's not true, because I just had a conversation where I added an additional message, but it also saw what came before, and it remembered the prior instructions that it had gotten, and it took into account the new instructions. And that means that it's seeing the whole conversation, and that whole conversation is part of the prompt. That's important because what else does that mean as part of the prompt? All the examples that it generated. Every time it wrote an email and then I followed up, its email that it wrote also became part of the prompt. So now we're not just getting my instructions that are going into the prompt. It's its output is becoming part of the prompt. It is helping us create the prompt and build this big prompt with context. So every time it goes and generates a new email, it is inserting itself into the prompt. And then when I follow up with new instructions, particularly when my instructions reference something that was in its prior prompt, or I refine some idea that was in its prior prompt, all of this together is becoming part of the prompt. So when we go and we start iteratively working on a problem in a conversation, not only are we getting our refinements to the instructions, but we're also getting its output as examples that are either positive or negative or helping to provide context. And those together are being blended into the prompt, and that's really important. So if we go back and we actually copy this entire conversation, which I'm going to show you, here's my copy in the entire conversation with all the intermediate emails into a prompt. That is, I copy and paste the conversation, I dump it into the prompt, and now I add the last instruction in my conversation, which was write this so it sounds less like marketing copy and more like a faculty member trying to convey the importance of a curriculum edition. We still get an email generated that looks similar to the one that was at the end and is capturing a lot of those aspects. So it has essentially helped us build one big prompt, but its examples have become part of the prompt. Its output has become part of the prompt. Its output has become additional context. And when I go and refine my prompt, essentially, when I go and follow up with a new prompt, not only is it getting the context of my new instruction, but it's getting the instruction in the context of what it just produced, because there's a relationship, right? You can think about having a conversation. If somebody has just shown you something and then you give them a new instruction, they're understanding that what they just showed you is what you're responding to, and it's adding additional context to the instruction. So when you think back, and we talked about how instructions need context and they can be misinterpreted or interpreted different ways, the fact that we are seeing its output and now we're seeing an additional instruction gives additional context about the meaning of that instruction. And so the entire conversation itself becomes more powerful because it has the model's output within it, and it's not just our instructions. So if we go and we just start a new conversation, dump new instructions in, we're not getting those examples of additional context. Now, sometimes those examples can create issues in our conversation. If it's producing a lot of bad stuff, the bad stuff itself can become, poor context, bad information that it might begin paying attention to that may not help us. But in many, many, many cases, that additional information that's producing, especially if we're iteratively getting it better and better and better, is actually helping us. It's moving in a direction of, leading to the right thing that we want. And the difference between just taking the prompt, adding some instructions, and starting a new conversation and iteratively refining through a conversation is we are getting additional examples and output from it brought into the conversation, which means that it's being brought into the prompt too. It's actually creating and helping us create the prompt at the same time. And that is a key difference. My father was a professor of creative writing. And I was talking to him about this idea of how difficult it is to actually get generative AI to write the way that you want it to write, because he's always complaining if he sees something that I have written with generative AI, and usually sometimes I get sloppy with my prompt engineering and maybe I get something that's not that great. And he told me, he's like, I can always tell the difference between your writing and something that you've used generative AI. And I think that's probably true most of the time. Now, I think I could prompt engineer my way into something that he could not tell the difference. But, he talked about, and I was like, if you had to go and write like somebody, wouldn't that be really hard? And he said, no, I could do that, no problem. And I was a little bit skeptical, and we talked about it. But the first thing that he said he would do is, I think, something that's really interesting, because we don't think about this when we think about prompt engineering. I said, how would you do that? And he said, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to read a lot of the person's writing, and I'm going to learn from it. I'm going to learn their style. And this is exactly what we do not do often in prompt engineering, is teach the model to learn from our style. And what does this mean? Well, the way we do this is with in-context learning. Now I want to give you a quick review of what in-context learning is, and then we're going to really learn how to harness this throughout this course. We're going to learn all kinds of really valuable things that we can do with in-context learning. Now, what is in-context learning? Well, in-context learning is where we show the model examples of what we want. We give it pattern and things that it can learn from. It's where it picks up ideas and styles and patterns out of the prompt that we gave it. And in fact, everything we did with the iterative refinement, it was actually doing this along the way because it had examples in that conversation where it was learning from them. So what does that look like? Well, here's an example. I'm going to give it some dialogue. So I'm going to give it dialogue of two people speaking. Now, I'm not going to tell it who these people are or what their perspective on life is or what their style of communication is. I'm just going to give them back and forth dialogue. So I'm going to say, Susan, wow, this is an amazing rainbow. And I say this because we saw an incredible rainbow yesterday driving around in Nashville, so it's top of mind. Jill, there's definitely a rainbow there. So what? Susan, I feel so inspired by it. Ideas are flooding my head. Jill, yes, there's a rainbow there. I've seen other rainbows. Why should I care? Now, you as a human being understand what's going on here, right? You've already built yourself a mental model of these two people having this conversation. You know all kinds of things about Jill and Susan, and you understand differences in how they communicate and their style simply by looking at the examples. And in-context learning is where we use the large language model to do the same thing. We teach it through examples what we want. And if we then go and we say, situation, the sun is setting, and Susan, colon, so what we're telling it is, go and generate the dialogue for Susan based on these examples because we're having a conversation. So you notice even the prefix, the Susan colon, it's learned that this is really an instruction almost for me. This is the point where I need to go and fill in what Susan is saying. And it's getting that from the context. It's in-context learning. It's learning what it's supposed to do, but it's learning all kinds of other things about who Susan is and who Jill is from looking at the examples of the conversation. And now it says, Susan, it's not just the rainbow, Jill. It's the way it arches over the horizon, merging with the sunset. The colors are so vivid, and it feels like a promise of new possibilities. It's moments like these that remind me of how beautiful and unpredictable life can be. Don't you ever feel that way? I love it. It picked up on what I was trying to capture in that example with a very, very little information. And then if I follow up and I say, in the conversation, Jill, colon, it knows I need to fill in Jill's dialogue. How does it know? Because of in-context learning. It knows that whenever there was Jill, colon, that was where the dialogue for Jill got filled in. And then does it know Jill? Yes. It knows that Jill's kind of she's not excited about this. She's like, Jill, I guess I can see that it is pretty with the sunset. Maybe I'm just not in the right mood to appreciate it fully. Like that understated, so what, who cares? It's totally capturing it. Now think about this. If you had to describe Jill and Susan completely in instructions, if you had to go and fully flesh out all the instructions to describe Susan's mental state, how she writes, how she responds to things, and then Jill's mental state, and you really had to capture that well enough in language that you could hand it off to another human being and say, now, write the complete dialogue, but without showing them in examples. You're not allowed to show them examples. You have to completely capture those two people in this dialogue in instructions. It's going to be totally maybe not impossible, but it's going to be really, really tough compared to doing it with examples. If you show examples of writing, all kinds of things happen because you're giving examples of word choice, of tone of voice, of emotions, of all kinds of other things about stylistically, how they write and respond, what's going through their head at the moment. You're capturing all this information, but in a really, really dense way in examples. If you have to go and unpack that into instructions where you write, step 1, when you write with Susan, there should be a really emotional, positive response. Okay, well now I got to talk about, well, what type of language does Susan use? And now I got to talk about in this and this, and you start unpacking that into instructions, and suddenly a sentence from Susan provides so much information as an example. You unpack it into instructions, and it requires like 10 times as much writing to try to produce the instructions that captures the same information. Examples can be extremely information dense, and that's why they're so powerful. Now, when we saw iterative refinement in conversation, we were using examples in the conversation, and that was helping us. Examples of what was good and what was bad, and providing context for the instructions. And that's in context learning, is the model is learning from the examples. Super, super important. Now, let's go and start looking at what if we want to change the style some more and get really specific. And so the specific thing that I want to happen is I want Jill now to be excited, and I want Jill to write in all caps. So I've created a new prompt, I've started a new conversation, and I've given the same examples before. I've got Susan and then Jill, but now Jill is excited, Jill is all caps. And I go and I prompt for Susan, it says the colors are vibrant, and then I prompt for Jill, and you notice what happens now. Not all caps. Hasn't followed the style. Now, you as a human being, you look at this and you probably get it immediately that, oh, Jill should probably be all caps too. You know, that's pretty obvious, but the model's not quite as good yet, so it doesn't see it. So how do we fix this, right? It's not following exactly what we want. It learned a lot, but it didn't learn enough. How do we fix it? Well, one way we could fix it is we could go and augment our examples with instructions. So we start putting the two together. And we say only Jill writes in all caps, Susan uses some caps. So I'm providing additional context through instructions, and then I'm providing examples. And it turns out that now when I go and I prompt again for Susan and Jill, the right thing happens. Susan uses some caps, Jill uses all caps. Now, what this shows us is there's an important sort of balance we have to strike. Some things are going to be more concise and easier to express in instructions. Like sometimes in order to show that something a particular rule should be followed, it requires a lot of examples to show that that rule needs to be followed. At the same time, certain things that we want to happen are much more concise and information dense when expressed as examples. And so this is why we're going to probably always use both, or very often we're going to use both. If we know some of the instructions that are very concise and easy to express that will help interpretation of the examples and understanding of the examples, by all means we should put them together, because that can help us go and build powerful prompts. We want examples, we want instructions. Now, we might be able to get away with all examples, and in this case, you know, we probably could. So what I'm going to show you something is, let's go back to this prompt. I'm going to continue the conversation, and we'll see that it gets it, it understands the rules, and it starts following the rule that Jill is always in all caps. And so I followed out this conversation. Now I'm going to do something. I'm going to copy and paste this whole conversation because we know it's one big prompt anyways. So I'm going to copy and paste it, and I'm going to just build one big prompt that's got more conversation. But what I've done is I've removed the instructions that Jill should be in all caps, because it was a problem before. When I had this shorter prompt with just a few examples, Jill wasn't all caps in the response. So what I'm doing now is I'm going and I'm adding into my original prompt, I'm adding examples. And this is few shot examples. I'm giving it examples in the prompt. When we're talking about in-context learning, we start using terms like few shot examples, and that's about how many examples we're giving in the prompt. If we have a few examples like we do here, we call it few shot. So I'm giving it a few shot prompt, which is now I've expanded my dialogue a little more. I've got more examples of Jill using all caps, and basically I've just cheated a little bit. I've gone to and had a conversation with iterative refinement. I've copied those examples, I put them into the prompt, and now I've got a bigger one, but I've removed the instruction. But now it's seen enough examples that it gets it. Even though I've removed my instruction, it now sees that Jill is always all caps, and it follows that rule. But I didn't have to tell it. So this kind of shows us something important. We can trade-off. We can put things in instructions, we can put things in examples. Sometimes things are going to be way more information dense and better to put in examples. It'll provide way more information than we could ever get into instructions. Sometimes it's just going to be easier to put it into instructions. And part of what we're doing in prompt engineering is striking that balance of what needs to go where. And we also know these are two different levers that we can pull when we're trying to control the output of the generative AI and help us do some really hard task like writing in a particular voice and style that we want. Now I want you to, just to kind of drive home why examples are so important. I want you to imagine that you've got a new intern. And this intern has never read William Faulkner before, or never read some other author. And you decide, you know what, I'm going to write them a step-by-step set of instructions of how to write like William Faulkner, or write like some other author that has a particular, very particular style. It's going to be hard. It's going to be super hard to do. In fact, that list of instructions is probably gigantic, and I'm not sure if we can write a precise enough set of instructions that would teach somebody to write in another person's style. And that's part of the reason why so many people fail at using generative AI to write things that, sound the way they want, is because they're focused just on instructions. No, what I'm going to do if I want to have that intern learn to write in the style of William Faulkner or some other writer is I'm going to go and tell the intern, go and read from that author. Read their writing and learn from it. And that's what in-context learning is it's learning from real-world examples of what we want. Now, this is writing, and it's very information stylistic, has all kinds of things rolled up into one. We're going to look later at how we use this same concept to solve all kinds of really important problems. But writing is a great starting point to look at this because writing is so difficult to do well. And it really helps to drive home the point that if we just focus on instructions, which is what so many people do in prompting, in fact, they get stuck on one type of instruction, answer this question. That's the instruction that most people never go beyond in prompt engineering. To go beyond that, we have to start understanding different ways of building prompts. And instructions are never going to be sufficient for many, many types of problems, particularly writing, which you're not going to write the list of instructions that tells somebody who's never read William Faulkner how to write like William Faulkner. You're not going to be able to do it. You might get them to be able to go and read and learn from William Faulkner and write stuff that looks more like William Faulkner, but you're not going to be able to do it through a set of instructions. But there are certain things where it's going to be a whole heck of a lot easier to explain it to the person with an instruction than to go and try to have them figure it out from the examples. So this is an important thing to note. We can modify instructions, we can modify examples. Both of those things are going to help us in producing writing, but also in prompt engineering in general and all the things that we will see later. Now that we've seen the different components of a prompt that we can use to help manipulate the writing and the output, we can start putting these together into a pattern that we can use to then help us build a voice for how we want to write and when we're using generative AI. And so we can begin using this to build a pattern for a prompt that we can then fill in and use to build up our own voice that allows us to control the generative AI and what it says, how it formats it, and all of this other stuff. So I want to give you a look at what this pattern is, and it's called the writing persona pattern. So I'm going to start off with a task that's a hard task in writing, right? I have this paper that I wrote, and I want to write a new section to it. Let's imagine that I've come up with a new pattern. So the original paper did not have the audience persona pattern, and so I want to write the audience persona pattern section of this paper. Now, every pattern that was in this paper had a very specific format, tone, sort of way that the patterns were discussed, and I want it to write in that style. Now, if I just go in and I sort of naively prompt, ChatGPT, for example, and I say, write a section of it on a new pattern called the audience persona, it writes something that's not at all right. It's not even remotely close to the style of writing in the paper. It doesn't have the right format. It doesn't have the right ideas. So if you look at it, for example, it says the concept of the audience persona is an evolution in understanding and engaging with your target demographic. Unlike traditional buyer personas, which often focus on the end customer's demographics, psychographics, and behavior patterns, it's totally missed it. This is about generative AI. It's fundamentally missed what this is about because this is a terrible prompt. It doesn't even remotely capture what is needed to try to write a new section of this paper. So let's use a pattern to fix this. We're going to use the writing persona pattern. And the idea behind this is it's a pattern for crafting a prompt that would allow you to write in a particular style, with a particular format, with particular ideas. So here's the basic format of this pattern. You're going to have a series of instructions on what or how to write, and then you're going to have examples of the writing that you want it to look at and learn from a stylistic perspective. Now, this actually format can work for all kinds of other things too, but we're going to start with looking at it in the context of writing. So we will say, here's some instructions. Then we'll say, here are examples of how I want you to write in terms of style. And then we have some type of separator, and this is important. And then we have the samples of the writing. Now, why do we have the separators here? Well, we might have writing that itself has instructions in it. And we want to try to tell the large language model, what you're looking at here is examples of how to write. It's not a set of instructions to follow. So for example, you can imagine if you had like recipes or a sample of writing that had step-by-step instructions on how to write a good recipe, it might suddenly look at those step-by-step instructions of how to write a good recipe and then start trying to write a recipe for you. And that's not what you want. What you want it to do is you want it to understand that this is samples of the writing and this is not a bunch of instructions. So we typically want to have some separators like these dashes or a bunch of equal signs or something in text to clearly visually separate that this is examples to look at, samples of what you want to learn from, not a bunch of instructions. Critical point. So this is the basic format and pattern of our prompt. Now, we could have the instructions at the top. We could have them at the bottom. You may want to experiment with that. Different research says that one place will be better than the other. I think the jury's still out on this one of where it should go, but you'll have to kind of experiment with that. The key thing is you have instructions on what to write and sort of high-level rules how, and then you have samples of the writing. So I'm going to build my prompt. I'm going to say, this is an example of my writing, and basically I have gone into my paper and I have just copied and pasted almost the entire introduction out of that paper in to the prompt. I then separated it and I've basically given it all of this information from my paper. That's a lot of information about how I write stylistically and a lot of the ideas behind my writing in this paper. And then I have the instructions, which are write a section on a new pattern called the audience persona. So you notice this is a totally different type of prompt from what I started with, where I just had some instructions. The moment we begin adding examples, we're going to get much, much bigger prompts, and that is a fantastic thing. And if you're using a tool that does not allow you to go and put in a lot of information into your prompt, you probably want to think about switching tools. Because the moment that you are limited in what information you can put into the prompt, if you're trying to put a lot of information in there and it said, hey, you've exceeded the character limit, it's also telling you, hey, I've limited your prompt engineering power here. I've limited your ability to write in your own voice. I've limited you in all kinds of these ways. So how much you can put into this prompt is really, really important. So we got a long prompt here, and now what do we get? The audience persona pattern is designed to tailor the responses of large language models to align with the characteristics, preferences, and expectations of a specific audience. This pattern ensures that the generated content is not only relevant and accurate, but also engaging and understandable for the intended readers. By integrating the audience persona into prompt engineering, LLMs can deliver more impactful and contextually appropriate outputs, enhancing user satisfaction and effectiveness in communication. Pattern description. And then it talks about it. And here's the sort of more complete. And then it goes in and it starts saying context, problem. And these were were basically sections that were described, basically subsections that were described for the patterns. Now, what's interesting is I didn't actually give it one of the subsections that I wanted to write, but it still did a pretty good job based on the context. You can see how we have gone from garbage output to dramatically better output. That I look at this and I'm like, that's a reasonable starting point for me to build off of as a draft. I think it did a good job. And now I could go back and I could iterate in the conversation. I could say, here's some additional things I want you to add into that description. I could iteratively refine it and begin building up that language within that style that I want. But the other thing that's really important is this gigantic prompt that I've created now becomes a writing persona that I can capture and I can tap into. When I want to go and I want to write about prompt patterns, which is something that I write about, I can go and I can take that prompt where I've given it a lot of information on my writing and other instructions. I can build that up and put that into my library of prompts, and I can use it to go and write. Now, some people say, like, generative AI, you don't want it to write for you. Well, it's not writing for me, it's writing in my style. I have taken control of it. I had to write a lot and understand my own writing in order to build this prompt. I had to understand my voice and what I want to be said and the ideas to craft this prompt. I'm just going through and I'm going through the process in a different way. Now, how much of this do I do? I do some of it, but it actually takes a lot of work to build one of these prompts. And that's why I say you use it as a pattern. And because if you put the work into doing this, it's something that you want to have as a reusable way to get a starting point of a draft. And that's the other thing that's really important is, like, no matter how much information I typically go in to put into this, I'm typically going to get a prompt that generates a good draft. But the key is that the draft will be so much closer than if I go in and I naively prompt with just a bunch of instructions. So this is the starting point for beginning to build writing, is we have to give it a lot of information on context and style, and using the writing persona helps us to do that because it's building up a persona of me and my style of writing and the structure and things. But it's not always going to work, and it's not going to give you perfect text. Most of the time I find I get a draft that I then go and refine and edit, and I'm always going to read every single word in that, and I'm going to make sure that I believe in it, that it is my opinion, that it accurately reflects my style, and I'm going to take responsibility and ownership for it. So although I want to teach you this to go and help you write better through generative AI, I don't think you want to use it to replace your writing. I think you want to use it as an aid to your writing, as a tool. I don't want you to stop thinking about what you're writing because you're using generative AI. I want you to think more about it. You want to get a draft and then think, okay, now how do I make this even better? What ideas are not captured that I should have there? It's that starting point of getting me over the hump into the writing, but really giving me lots of time to think about, what do I want to say? What's missing now in this draft? Or I go and I generate 3 different versions of this draft, and I look at them all. And I say, what are the ideas that are captured well? What are the stylistic things that are captured well or not well? And I begin iterating on my writing. It's a tool to help me think more about what I'm writing, not less. So make sure you use this pattern in that way. I think this is really, really important. The examples that we select to go into our writing persona are really, really important, but they also mean that our personas are probably going to be limited in a particular way that I want to talk to you about. So the examples are what it's going to learn from. And it's really, really important that our examples show how to solve the right problem. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, if you develop a writing persona and you do something like I did, where I took one of my papers and I copied a bunch of the text out of it, and then I create this writing persona with it, I'm showing it how to solve the problem of writing like me for an academic paper. I'm not showing it how to write like me for social media. I'm not showing it how to write like me to answer an email from my wife or to send out an email to my colleagues. That is, the example that I'm giving it is highly, highly specific to a particular problem that I'm trying to solve by writing, which is writing an academic paper. And the moment that you take that example out of context, if I try to take that example and use it to write an email back in response to my wife, I'm going to get the wrong tone of voice. I'm going to get the wrong type of information, the wrong format, structure, all that, these types of things. So when you're building a writing persona, what you're not trying to do is say, mimic me forever for all situations with this sample of my writing, because it's highly unlikely you're going to be able to get there. So what you want to think about is you're building personas that have the right set of examples. But also fundamentally, we want to think about when we're using examples and prompts, we've got to get the right examples. If we give it the wrong examples, like an academic paper, and then we say, respond to my wife based on that academic paper, I'm probably not going to get the right email out. That's probably going to have the wrong tone, the wrong content, a bunch of things that just aren't quite right. So once we select examples and put them in, we're going to have locked in that prompt to a particular sort of problem space, a particular type of writing. Later, we'll see we've locked the LLM into solving a particular type of problem in a particular way, in a particular context. So the examples are really, really important that we select and put in a prompt. And if we have the wrong examples, we're not going to do the thing that we want to do, because the LLM is not going to have enough context. Now, just to drive this home, I'm going to take that original prompt, that writing persona that I built from my academic paper and the introduction to it. I'm going to take that long prompt, but now I'm going to take it and I'm going to say, write an email to my colleagues announcing my new prompt engineering course. So I've given it a context that kind of is right, like it's about prompt engineering and it's, kind of to an academic audience. Is it close enough that it will get the email right? And the answer is no, it doesn't. We write and go back to, I am thrilled to announce, and absolutely nothing in that, original paper is I am thrilled to announce. Nothing. Why did this happen? It happened because we didn't give it examples of the right type of writing, and it's reverting to something that's closer to email writing that it's seen. Because it's looking at this and it's saying, well, this isn't really an email, so it's trying to write something that looks more like email. What I would need to do if I wanted it to write more like me in an email is I need to give it samples of me and my emails, not samples of my academic writing, because I'm pulling in examples that are the wrong thing. Now, the other thing that might have happened is it might have written a very academic email that sounded like a research paper as opposed to an email. But you can see the challenge is that the examples really, really need to match the task that you're trying to get it perform. If the task is to write an academic paper, then give it samples of your writing from an academic paper. But if you're now going to take that and try to write an email with it, your examples are no longer right. And so it's in-context learning doesn't have the right information to learn from. At the same time, if your examples aren't having enough information on the right formatting, of the right strategy for solving the problem, of the right ideas that need to be in the answer or the response, all of these things have to be carefully crafted. The selection of examples that we put into the prompt are really, really important. This is really important for in-context learning. It matters with our writing example, but when we go and we expand in-context learning to solve other problems, the same thing applies. If our examples are not right, if they are not carefully selected to fit the problem that we're trying to solve, we're going to run into problems just like we did here. When we're just trying to solve one simple problem right now, often going through and iterating in a conversation and giving refinement and iteratively sort of solving the problem in the conversation is the best way. But sometimes we want to build prompts that are reusable, like these writing personas, and we're really going to spend time thinking about how do we improve that prompt and what is the process for building that prompt. Now, one of the things that I've heard a lot about is people say, well, I just don't know what process to follow or how to start. Like some people just seem to be able to figure this stuff out. I don't really know how to go and build a prompt that's reusable that I can, try out a lot. Now, we've seen with the writing persona how we can do this, sort of a structure that we can use to go and build things. Now, there's other patterns we can use, but I want to give you a sort of basic process that can be really powerful and can be applied to a lot of different contexts to build really robust prompts that are pretty strong and can do what you want. Now, it doesn't work in all contexts, but it's one process that I find really helpful and that I use myself. And I started realizing that I was doing the same thing over and over, and so I gave it a name, and this is something that I teach people now. And this is called preference-driven refinement of prompts. And I want to take you through this process. Basically, what we're going to do is we are going to leverage the LLM to help us build the examples for our prompt that we can use to show it how to solve the problem. Now, sometimes I don't have a lot of text that's solving the problem in the way that I want, or that doesn't sound like I want, or I don't have examples that I can show it of, whatever problem I want solved. And so I might have to go and create those myself by hand, but a lot of times when I'm using generative AI, I don't want to do everything by hand. So let me show you the process, and I'll come back to these steps in a minute, and we'll explain them, and they'll make a lot more sense. So I'm going to go back, and I'm going to solve this problem of I'm writing an email to my colleagues to announce my new prompt engineering course. I don't, have a bunch of sample emails sitting around that I can collect that have the right tone that I want to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by asking it, write an email to my colleagues announcing my new prompt engineering course. Now I'm going to use the naive prompt, and I'm going to get it to generate some output. And it goes through and it generates an email that's got a lot of problems, like the one that I keep harping on, which is it says, I'm thrilled to announce, and I'm never going to say that in an email. Now, how do I start improving my prompt other than just going and trying to add instructions and copy and paste, examples maybe of my writing, which I don't have in this case? What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what it produced in its output, and I'm going to identify what I like about it and what I don't like about it. So I don't like I'm thrilled to announce. I'm not ever going to say that. I do like this other section that it produced in another time. So what I did is I only generated that one time, but I generated multiple times just with that one prompt to get some different outputs from it. And I'm going to take sections of its output, and I'm going to copy and paste them, and I'm going to bring them back into the prompt like this. I'm going to say examples of what I don't like, and then I'm going to separate those off, and I'm going to give it some examples of what I don't like, examples of what I like, and then I'm going to give it examples of what I like. And so I'm injecting my preferences into the prompt. And the way that I'm doing this is I'm having it generate some output. A lot of it I don't like, some of it I do like, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give it feedback by selecting from what it created that I liked and bring it into the prompt, and what it created that I don't like and bringing it in the prompt. And so I'm injecting my preferences into the prompt by taking examples of what it created and bringing them back and labeling them as either things I like or don't like. Now, there's other ways you could label this, and we'll see that later, but you kind of get the basic idea. I'm using it to generate output. I'm taking its output, and I'm essentially giving it feedback by selecting what I like and what I don't like from its output and bringing it back into the prompt. At the same time, I will typically go and add an extra instruction or two to help sort of refine. So in this case, I say, write an email to my colleagues announcing my new prompt engineering course, and then I add an additional sentence, something that I didn't tell it originally, which is emphasize the importance of prompt engineering for graduate students performing research. So I am doing preference-driven refinement, and two things are happening. One, I'm generating examples, and I'm taking selections of those examples that I liked and didn't like, and I'm bringing them back into the prompt. And then two, I'm adding some additional instructions. So now I have this new, bigger prompt. I go and run it again, and now I'm getting output that's starting to look better. It says, I'm pleased to inform you about the launch of our new course. So it's ditched, I'm thrilled. And it's got some more sort of structure and things that I like in here. And I'm going to go through this process again, where I'm going to find excerpts from its output that I like and excerpts from its output that I don't like, and I'm going to copy and paste those back into the prompt as yet additional examples of what I like and what I don't like. Now, you can use this to express and give examples of things other than what I like and don't like, but we're still kind of thinking about it in this context of writing, but you can begin to see how you can generalize this idea for other problems with prompt engineering. So I go back and I said, now I have a bigger list of things I like, bigger list of things I don't like, and I add one additional instruction, which is use simple and direct language without too many adjectives like exciting, good, etc. So I have, through this simple process of get it to generate some output, take things I like and don't like, put them back into the prompt. I am starting to build up this robust prompt that's rich with examples, but also is incrementally building on the instructions. And now, when it goes and it generates that email, I get something that is actually not too bad. Now I've got a draft that's much closer to something that I would be willing to use, something that doesn't take a ton of editing for me to take from this form into something I could, reuse. And now I've got a reusable prompt where I can go and start taking this prompt, and when I need to draft some announcement email, it may not work for other emails because an announcement email is probably different from an email responding to a particular colleague. But now if I need to craft an email announcement and send it to colleagues, that's probably a prompt that I could use as a starting point. So I want to go back and review these steps, these simple steps. Step 1, build just a simple, normal prompt. Doesn't have to be super sophisticated. Input it into the large language model and get some output out. Step 2, go and find sections in that output that you like or don't like and copy and paste them. You're going to want those as examples to help guide it. Those are your preferences. Now, you don't have to do examples of what you don't like, but showing it what you like is critically important from my experience. You're going to take those examples of what you like and optionally what you don't like, and you're going to put them back into the prompt as examples. So you're basically modifying your prompt to incorporate what it produced that you liked and what it produced that you didn't like as examples of what to do or what not to do. And then you might add an instruction or two to the prompt. And then you're going to generate more output. And at each step, you can generate multiple times with the same prompt. And in fact, that's a good practice to get a lot of different examples that you can draw from for your preferences. And then you're going to take those examples, you're going to put them back in as what you like or what you don't like. You're going to add an instruction or two, and you're going to repeat the process. And you keep repeating this process until you get output that you like. What I find is this can be an extremely effective process for going from a prompt that isn't at all producing what you want to one that is producing fantastic output that you can then reuse. And I want to just take you back as a quick review of what this final prompt looked like. We have some instructions that we've built up, and they're not complex instructions. They don't have a ton of information in there, but they have some simple rules. We have a bunch of examples of what we don't like and a lot of examples of what we do like, and then we're telling it what to write. And what we're getting is a prompt that's now becoming reusable through a consistent process that we can apply over and over. You have something that you want to build a prompt for that's reusable. You start off with your instructions. Have it generate some output. Go find examples of what it did well or what it didn't do well. And if you need to generate multiple times with that same prompt to get those examples, that's fine. But find those examples of what it did well and what it didn't do well, copy and paste them, and bring them back into the prompt and tell them, this is what you did well, this is what you didn't do well. You're basically giving it feedback through a kind of interesting little process. Then go back and generate again multiple examples. Find what you like and what you don't like, bring it back into the prompt, and maybe add some additional instructions. And just repeat this process, and what you'll see is it quickly hones in on prompts that you can reuse that get you to where you want to be. This simple process of what do I like, what do I don't like, how do I get it to generate more of what I like and less of what I don't like. But it's not something where you're just going to go and say, do it once. You're going to have to really think and inject your own thought into how do I build this prompt. And the way that you're injecting your thought into it is by selecting what you do and don't like. You are becoming the judge, but then critically, you're taking your feedback and giving it back to it in the prompt. And this is the step that most people miss, is they go and give it a prompt, get output, they don't like it, they try again by modifying the prompt, but they never gave it feedback on what it did well or what it did not do well. And they missed out on the power of in-context learning because they didn't give it examples.